There are moments in life when you realize that the person sitting across from you has already decided who you are, and nothing you do, nothing you say, nothing you sacrifice will ever be allowed to change their mind. I had one of those moments on a Tuesday night in my daughter Nadia's dining room, sitting at a table I had paid for, eating food I had quietly helped purchase, being told by a man named Derek, a man who had known me for less than 3 years, that I owed him an apology I did not owe him. And my daughter, my own Nadia, sat next to him with her arms folded and told me that if I did not apologize to her husband before I left that house, I was out of the family. 41 years I had carried that girl. 41 years. And she handed me the door like I was a stranger who had worn out his welcome. So I pushed back my chair, looked her directly in the eye, said 5 words, and walked out into the cold night air. I have never once regretted it. Before I take you through everything that led to that Tuesday night, every sacrifice, every warning sign I missed, every moment I told myself it would get better, I want to ask you something. If you had given someone your whole life, your money, your time, your loyalty, and they still handed you an ultimatum, would you have stayed at that table? Think about that while I tell you what really happened, because this story does not start in that dining room. It starts much earlier, in a house I built with my own hands, and a daughter I raised alone. My name is Lewis, and I am 63 years old. I'm a retired civil engineer who spent 37 years designing bridges, roads, and drainage systems across 3 different states. I tell you that not to impress you, but because it matters to this story. I am a man who spent his entire working life making sure that structures could hold weight. I understood load-bearing capacity. I understood stress fractures. I understood what happened when you pushed something past the point it was designed to carry. I understood all of that professionally with great precision for decades. And yet somehow, in my own home, with my own family, I kept ignoring every crack until the whole structure came down. My wife, Marlene, passed away when our daughter Nadia was 14 years old. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. Marlene was here one spring, and by the following winter she was gone. I was 42 years old, suddenly alone, raising a teenage girl who was grieving and angry and confused, and I made a choice that I believed was the right one. I chose Nadia. I put her first in every single decision I made from that point forward. I turned down a significant promotion that would have required relocation because Nadia was in her junior high years and I refused to uproot her. I stayed in the same house, drove the same route to work, attended every school event, every parent-teacher meeting, every volleyball game, every drama production she ever participated in. I cooked dinner most nights. I hired a tutor when her grades slipped after Marlene died. I drove her to grief counseling for 2 years. I sat outside in parking lots waiting for her, reading technical manuals, drinking gas station coffee, and being grateful that she was inside getting the help she needed. I'm not telling you any of this to make myself sound heroic. I'm telling you because it is the truth and because it is the foundation of what came later. When Nadia went to college, I helped pay for it. Not all of it. I wanted her to have some financial responsibility, but I covered the larger portion. When she graduated with a degree in marketing and moved to a city 4 hours away to start her career, I helped her with the first and last month's rent on her apartment. When her car broke down 6 months after graduation, I drove 4 hours to bring her a certified check so she could buy a used replacement. I did these things without being asked to do them twice. I did them because she was my child and I loved her, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, I believed that this was what a good father did. I want to be fair here. Nadia and I had a good relationship for most of her adult years. We called each other regularly. She visited at holidays. She told me about her work, her friends, her life. I felt close to her. I felt that the sacrifices I had made after Marlene died had been worth it. We had gotten through the hard years. We were okay. I believed that. Then Nadia met Derek. She met him at a corporate event in the city she lived in. He was in sales, mid-level, charming in the way that certain people are charming, the kind of charm that feels warm and easy right up until the moment it doesn't. Nadia called me the week after they met, and she was excited in a way I had not heard from her in years. I was genuinely happy for her. She was 38 at the time, had been through 2 previous relationships that had not worked out, and I could hear in her voice that this felt different. I said all the right things. I told her to take her time, get to know him, and that I looked forward to meeting him eventually. I met Derek for the first time about 4 months later when Nadia brought him home for Thanksgiving. He was 41, tall, well-dressed, confident. He shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye when he spoke, which I generally take as a good sign. He talked a lot about his career, his ambitions, a sales territory expansion he was managing. He was interesting enough to talk to. I noticed a few things, though, small things at first. He did not ask me a single question about myself that entire evening. He redirected conversations back to himself fairly often. When Nadia spoke, he sometimes finished her sentences, and not always accurately, but she would just smile and correct him gently and move on. I noticed these things. I filed them away. I told myself every person has quirks. I told myself it was just first meeting nerves. I was determined not to be the kind of father who found fault with the man his daughter chose. By Christmas, they were engaged. Nadia called me on a Monday morning, and I could barely understand her at first because she was crying and laughing at the same time. Derek had proposed on a weekend trip. She was elated. I congratulated her warmly and meant it. She asked if I was happy for her. I told her I was, and I was. Whatever small doubts I had carried since Thanksgiving felt petty in the face of her joy. I decided to move forward and give Derek a genuine chance. The engagement period was where the first real cracks appeared, though I did not recognize them as cracks at the time. I thought of them as friction, adjustment, the normal tension that comes when two families are learning to operate together. In this case, it was really just Derek's preferences beginning to shape the space that Nadia and I had always shared. The first thing I noticed was the timing of our calls. Nadia and I had spoken on the phone every Sunday for years, a habit that began when she first moved to the city. After the engagement, those calls became shorter and less regular. Sometimes she would text instead of call. Sometimes she would call but sound distracted, and I would hear Derek's voice in the background asking her something. I told myself this was normal. Couples reorganize their lives when they get serious. I did not make it a source of complaint. The second thing I noticed was that when I did see Nadia in person, Derek was always present, and Derek seemed to have opinions about everything, including things that involved just Nadia and me. Once, when I drove up to the city to take Nadia to lunch, a tradition we had maintained for years, Derek joined us without Nadia mentioning in advance that he would be there. That was fine. What was less fine was that he spent most of the lunch talking about what he thought Nadia's career trajectory should look like, and at one point made a comment about how her old friendships were holding her back. I did not say anything. I glanced at Nadia, but she was nodding along. After lunch, she hugged me warmly and said she was glad I had come. I drove the 4 hours home wondering what I had actually witnessed. The wedding planning was the next layer. Nadia had always mentioned, in a casual and sweet way across the years, that she imagined getting married in the town where she grew up. Not in any particular venue, just the general area, near the church where Marlene's memorial had been held, near the neighborhood where her childhood was. She had mentioned this to me at least 3 or 4 times over the years. I had assumed it was something she genuinely wanted. Derek wanted a destination wedding in a coastal resort that cost more than 3 times what a local event would have cost. Nadia wanted to make Derek happy. The destination wedding was what they chose. I supported it. I told Nadia that what mattered was that she was happy, and I gave a larger financial contribution toward the wedding than I had planned to, because the resort cost was significantly higher than anything we had originally discussed. I attended the wedding. I danced at the reception. I gave a toast that made people cry and laugh. I shook Derek's hand and told him to take care of my daughter. I felt the grief of Marlene not being there more acutely than I had expected, and I kept that private. Derek's parents were pleasant enough. His mother, Sandra, gave me a brief nod when we were introduced, as though she were granting me permission to be present. Derek's father, Ronald, was cordial but spoke almost exclusively about their family's history and business, like he was delivering a prepared brief. I did not take offense. I knew how these events worked. Families were complicated. I smiled and stayed present and wished my daughter well with my whole heart. The first year of their marriage passed without major incident. Nadia called when she called. I visited twice. Both times were pleasant on the surface, though I noticed that my visits always felt slightly rushed, as if there were a schedule I hadn't been told about. Once, I arrived on a Friday afternoon, and Derek mentioned on Saturday morning that they had a brunch with friends that he was looking forward to, phrased in a way that made it clear I was not part of the plan. Nadia asked if I minded, and of course I said I didn't. I spent that Saturday morning alone in their guest room reading, then drove home a day earlier than I had planned. The second year was when the relationship between Derek and me began its real downward movement. It started over money, though it was disguised as something else for a long time. Nadia called me in the spring of their second year married and told me that she and Derek were looking at buying a house. They had found one they loved in a neighborhood that had good schools and was close to Derek's office. The asking price was beyond what their combined mortgage pre-approval covered comfortably. She asked, in a roundabout way, whether I might be able to help with the down payment. I want to be clear about what I did not do. I did not hesitate. I did not make her feel guilty for asking. I did not say anything like, I already helped you so much. I simply said, how much do you need? And she told me, and I said, okay, and within 2 weeks I had transferred the money. It was a substantial amount, the kind that required me to liquidate a portion of an investment account. I did not tell Nadia exactly how I structured it because I did not want her to feel bad. I wanted her and Derek to have the house. Derek sent me a text message that said, "Thanks, Louis, appreciate it." That was the entire acknowledgement. When I visited that fall after they had moved in, Derek gave me a tour of the house with the energy of a man showing off something he had built entirely by himself. He mentioned the neighborhood, the proximity to good restaurants, the square footage, the finished basement. He did not once mention that the down payment had come from me. I was a guest in a house I had made possible, being toured by a man who spoke about it as though I had no connection to it at all. I watched Nadia during the tour. She was smiling and happy and proud of their home. I did not say anything. I reminded myself why I had made the contribution, which was for her, not for acknowledgement. But something shifted in me that day, something quiet and important. I began, for the first time, to look back at the whole sequence with clear eyes rather than hopeful ones. I started to notice that in every conversation involving money, the wedding, the apartment rent help years ago, the car, now the down payment, Derek always benefited, but the gratitude was always minimal and always fast. There was no ongoing awareness from Derek that I was a man who had given significantly. There was no reciprocity of any kind, not in the form of money, which I did not need, but in the form of basic human regard. He never asked about my retirement plans. He never asked about my health. He never once showed up at my home, though Nadia had visited dozens of times over the years. He never called me directly, not once. Every communication went through Nadia. I was useful to them when they needed something from me and invisible the rest of the time. I was trying to process all of this quietly, without alarming Nadia, without causing conflict, when Derek created the moment that changed everything. It was a Sunday in October. I had driven up to spend the weekend. We had planned to have dinner on Saturday, which had gone reasonably well, and on Sunday morning I was in their kitchen making coffee while Derek was in the living room watching something on television. Nadia was still upstairs. Derek called out to me without looking away from the screen. He asked me to grab him a mug too. Not could you, not please, not thanks. Just a casual command issued by someone who had decided that this was the appropriate way to speak to me. I stood in their kitchen for a moment and felt something shift in my chest. Then I made his coffee and brought it to him and said nothing. That evening, Nadia was on a call with a friend from work and Derek and I were in the living room. He started talking about their finances. He mentioned that property taxes in the area had increased and that their budget was getting tight. He said, quite casually, that it would be helpful if I could be a more consistent presence in their financial planning. He did not use the word money directly. He talked around it, but what he meant was clear. He thought that my contributions were not occasional gifts, but ongoing obligations. He thought I should be giving regularly and predictably. He said something to the effect that family helps family, and a man in my position, meaning retired and living alone, should naturally want to contribute to helping his daughter build something. Stable. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said I would think about it and excused myself to go to bed. I lay in that guest room for 3 hours without sleeping, running the full history through my mind. The missed gratitude, the house tour, the mug, and now this. The belief that I was a resource to be managed, not a father to be respected. I did not say anything to Nadia during that visit. I drove home and spent 3 weeks thinking very carefully about what I wanted to do next. I'm not an impulsive man. I believe in thinking before speaking, especially in matters that involve people I love. I wrote things down in a notebook. I made notes about specific incidents, specific dates, specific words. I am an engineer. I document things. I track patterns. And when I looked at my notes, the pattern was undeniable and had been building for nearly 3 years. In November, I made 2 decisions. First, I revised my will. I had always intended to leave everything to Nadia. I still intended to provide for her, but I restructured the document so that any inheritance would be held in a trust with specific conditions rather than transferred directly. This was not punitive. This was practical. I needed to know that what I left behind would actually reach my daughter, not be absorbed into a financial dynamic that already treated my contributions as entitlements. I met with my attorney, a woman named Patricia who had handled Marlene's estate and my own estate planning for years, and we spent 2 sessions restructuring the documents. Patricia did not ask unnecessary questions. She is a professional. She drafted exactly what I asked for. Second, I stopped making any financial transfers, quietly without announcement. No dramatic phone call, no confrontation. I simply stopped. The next time Nadia mentioned something vague about finances in a phone call, I listened warmly and did not offer anything. I was not cold to her. I was not unkind. I just stopped volunteering money. I wanted to see what would happen. What happened was instructive. Within 6 weeks, the calls from Nadia became more frequent and more pointed. Not aggressive, but searching. She would mention things in a sideways manner, Derek's hours being cut, the tax bill, a repair the house needed. I would listen and respond with empathy but offer no solution. This was genuinely difficult for me. I hated hearing Nadia sound worried. I hated feeling like I was withholding something she needed. But I needed to understand something first, something important. Was Nadia calling me because she missed her father, or was she calling me because Derek had sent her to find out why the contributions had stopped? The answer came in January, 3 months after I had made my quiet adjustments. Nadia called on a weekday afternoon, which was unusual, and her voice had a tightness to it that I recognized as rehearsed. She told me that things had been hard, that Derek was under a lot of pressure, and that they were wondering if I might consider putting them on some kind of regular support arrangement. She used that phrase, regular support arrangement, and I understood immediately that those were Derek's words, not hers. My daughter, for all her adult sophistication, had never in her life spoken to me like I was a vendor she was negotiating a contract with. I told her gently that I was not in a position to set up a regular arrangement, that my retirement income was fixed, and that while I loved her and would always be there for genuine emergencies, I could not commit to scheduled transfers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said okay, and we talked about other things, and the call ended without incident. But Derek did not let it go. The following month, I drove up for Nadia's birthday. I had planned a quiet dinner, just the three of us, at a restaurant she loved. We had been going to that restaurant together since before she met Derek. It was one of our places, a small Italian spot with good pasta and quiet tables and a staff who knew us. I had made a reservation, I had a gift for Nadia, and I was looking forward to a genuinely pleasant evening. When I arrived at their house, Derek was already dressed for dinner and greeted me with a handshake and an energy I can only describe as strategic. He was smiling, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Dinner started fine. We ordered, we talked, Nadia opened her gift and was genuinely pleased. But about 40 minutes in, Derek steered the conversation with the precision of someone who had planned the route in advance. He started talking about their future plans, a renovation they wanted to do, a business idea he had been developing, a timeline he had in mind for expanding their financial position. And then, quite directly, he looked across the table at me and said that in his family, it was understood that the older generation supported the younger generation as the younger generation built wealth. He said that he had always imagined that Nadia's father would be an active partner in their growth. He said the word partner the way someone says it when they mean source of funding. I put my fork down. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Nadia, who was looking at her plate. I told Derek calmly that I appreciated that he had different expectations of how family finances worked, but that I had been supporting Nadia in the ways I chose to support her for her entire life, and that my financial decisions were my own to make. Derek's expression shifted. He said he had not meant any offense, he was just being direct. I said I appreciated directness. Then we finished dinner, and I drove back to the hotel I was staying in. I had stopped staying in their guest room after the January call, and sat in the dark for a while thinking about my daughter and the life she was building, and whether I was going to be allowed to be a real part of it. Things cooled on the surface after that dinner, but they did not actually cool underneath. Derek had registered that I was not going to be managed easily, and I think that registered as a problem that needed to be solved a different way. The different way arrived in April. Nadia called me and asked if I would come up for a family dinner. She said they were having some people over, a couple of Derek's colleagues and their spouses, and she would love for me to be there. I said yes because I wanted to see Nadia and because I genuinely tried to stay present in her life. I drove up on a Saturday, brought a bottle of wine, arrived at the time she had given me. The dinner was fine until it wasn't. Derek's colleague, a man named Paul, was a loudly confident type who talked about money and real estate and returns as if the dinner table were a conference room. At one point, Paul made a comment about his father-in-law being, quote, the kind of man who understood that investment in the next generation was an investment in legacy. He said it looking at Derek, who looked at me. I understood the theater of it immediately. This had been arranged. This was a public version of the same pressure. I was supposed to feel the eyes on me and comply. I was supposed to hear the word legacy and feel something that would loosen my wallet. Instead, I turned to Paul and asked him what he did for work and let him talk about himself for the rest of the meal. Derek was quiet on the way out, and Nadia walked me to my car and hugged me and said she was glad I had come. I drove home, and that night I wrote in my notebook, orchestrated pressure. That was the last dinner I attended at their house for the next 3 months. Then came the real wound, and it came from a direction I did not expect. My brother Calvin, who lives 4 hours in the other direction, called me in June. Calvin and I are not as close as we were when we were young, but we speak regularly and I trust him. He told me that Derek had reached out to him, not to have a conversation, not to build a relationship, but to ask Calvin whether he thought Lewis, meaning me, was being unreasonable about his financial situation. Calvin said he had told Derek this was not something he could weigh in on. Derek had then apparently suggested that perhaps the family as a whole could have a conversation about how to help Lewis understand his responsibilities. I sat with that information for a long time. Derek had gone around me. He had contacted my own brother to create an alliance, to begin building a narrative in which I was the problem, in which my refusal to be an ongoing financial contributor was framed as some kind of failure on my part. He was not just applying pressure to me directly. He was trying to reshape how my own family saw me. I called Nadia that evening. I told her what Calvin had told me. There was a silence on the line. Then she said Derek was just trying to find a way forward, that he came from a culture where extended family discussed finances openly, that I was misunderstanding his intentions. I said very quietly that regardless of the intention, the action was a boundary violation, that my financial decisions were not appropriate topics for Derek to be shopping around to my family members, and that I needed her to be clear with me. Was she aware that Derek had done this? Another silence. Then she said she had not known he was going to call Calvin specifically, but that she and Derek had talked about how to help me see their perspective, and maybe Calvin was one of the people Derek thought could help with that. Help me see their perspective. I wrote that down in my notebook too. I told Nadia that I loved her, that nothing was going to change that, but that I needed to think about some things and that I would call her in a few days. She sounded worried. I reassured her I was fine and ended the call. Then I went and sat on my back porch and watched the yard go dark and felt the full weight of what had been happening for 3 years land on me all at once. The truth was no. Comfortable. The truth was that my daughter, the person I had reorganized my entire life to protect and support after her mother died, had allowed her husband to treat me as a financial instrument. She had not done it with cruelty. I believed she loved me. But she had been gradually, and perhaps not entirely consciously, letting Derek redefine what I meant to their household. I had moved from father to funding source. And when the funding source stopped flowing as freely as expected, Derek had begun a campaign to create external pressure and internal guilt to restore the flow. I also understood something about Nadia that I had not fully admitted to myself until that night on the porch. Nadia wanted peace above almost everything else. After her mother died, she had grown into a person who managed conflict by minimizing it. She was not a coward. She was a woman who had experienced a devastating loss at a formative age and had spent decades learning how to keep her world stable by avoiding confrontation. I understood that. I had probably contributed to it by being so accommodating myself. But the result was that when Derek pushed, Nadia did not push back at Derek. She redirected the pressure toward the path of least resistance, which was me. I made one more decision that summer. I reached out to Patricia and we had a third meeting. I made additional changes to my estate documents. I also, for the first time, spoke to Patricia about a second property I owned, a small rental house in the town where I lived that had been generating quiet income for nearly 15 years. I had never mentioned this property to Nadia or Derek. Not because I was hiding it, but because it had simply never come up and I had never had reason to discuss it. The rental income was modest but consistent. It was part of my financial stability. Patricia and I discussed how to structure that asset going forward. I wanted it protected. She handled it. The summer passed. Nadia and I maintained contact. Our calls were shorter and carried a careful quality, both of us aware that something had shifted, neither of us naming it directly. I did visit once in August briefly, and we had lunch together alone without Derek. That lunch was good. Nadia was warm and funny, and for 2 hours she felt like my daughter again rather than like a person who had been placed at a distance by someone else's architecture. I held onto that lunch. In September, Nadia told me that Derek's mother Sandra was coming to stay with them for several weeks. I said that was nice and asked how Sandra was doing. Nadia said she was doing well and then added, with a carefully neutral tone, that Derek's parents had always been very close-knit and that Sandra had strong views about how families operated together. I understood what Nadia was telling me without her being able to say it plainly. Sandra arrived and the calls from Nadia became even more infrequent. When we did speak, I could sometimes hear Sandra in the background, and once Nadia quickly ended a call with me that had barely started, saying Derek needed something. I did not press. It was in November, 14 months after I had begun my quiet adjustments, that the Tuesday dinner happened. The dinner I told you about at the beginning of this story. Nadia called me on a Thursday and asked if I would come for dinner the following Tuesday. She said she and Derek wanted to have a conversation. She said Sandra would be there too. I knew this was not going to be a casual evening. I could hear the rehearsed quality in her voice again, the careful flatness of someone delivering a scripted line. I said I would come. I made the 4-hour drive on a Tuesday morning, arrived in the early afternoon, checked into my usual hotel, and drove to Nadia's house that evening. The table was set nicely. Dinner was made. Sandra sat at the far end with the composed expression of someone who had decided in advance how the evening would go. Derek sat at the head of his own table in the physical posture of a man presiding over a hearing. Nadia sat to his left and did not quite meet my eyes when I came in. I sat where I was directed, across from Sandra, and we went through the motions of a normal dinner for 40 minutes. The food was good. I complimented it. I asked Sandra about her stay. She answered with minimal warmth and then steered the conversation to family. Sandra began by talking about how important it was for families to operate as units, to pool resources, to trust one another. She talked about her own family background, some long tradition of shared responsibility across generations. She spoke well. She was intelligent and composed. Derek listened with the satisfaction of a man who has prepared his witness properly. Nadia was very still. Then Derek said it plainly. He said that there had been a distance growing between our families and that he believed it came from my unwillingness to participate fully in their life together. He said word fully the way people do when they mean financially. He said that he had tried to be patient, that he had tried to open the conversation in several ways, but that he was being honest now. He felt I did not respect him or his household, and that if I could not show that respect by being a genuine contributor to their family, it was going to create a permanent fracture. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I kept my face neutral and my hands flat on the table. Then I looked at Nadia and said her name and asked her if this was what she wanted to say to me too. She looked at Derek first, a small glance that lasted less than a second, and then she looked at me and said that she just wanted everyone to be able to work together as a family. I asked her what that meant to her specifically. She said she wanted me to apologize to Derek for making him feel like his requests were unreasonable, and she wanted me to commit to having more open financial conversations with them going forward. There was a silence at the table that lasted several seconds. Then Nadia said the words she had likely been rehearsing for days. She said that she loved me and that she needed me to choose to be part of their family fully, and that if I could not apologize to Derek tonight and agree to communicate more openly going forward, she was going to have to take a step back from our relationship because she could not keep managing the tension between us. She said she needed peace in her home. She said Derek was her husband and her future, and that she needed to know her father could respect that. And then she said it. She said, "Apologize to my husband, Dad, or I'm going to have to ask you to step back from this family." I sat with that for a moment. I looked at Derek, who had his hands folded on the table and was watching me with the expression of a man who expects to win. I looked at Sandra, who was looking at her hands. I looked at Nadia, my daughter, who was looking at me with a complicated expression that I recognized. It was the look of someone who hoped they had done the right thing and was not entirely certain that they had. I thought about 41 years. I thought about Marlene. I thought about volleyball games in the rain, grief counseling parking lots, certified checks, wedding toasts, down payments, unreturned calls, orchestrated dinners, and a kitchen where I had been asked to fetch a mug like I was a household employee. I thought about the notebook and the documents and the rental house and the trust and everything I had quietly structured over the previous year because I had been paying attention. Then I pushed back my chair, looked at Nadia, and said 5 words: "I love you. Goodbye, Nadia." I stood up, folded my napkin beside my plate with the precision of someone who has been raised to be polite even in difficult moments, and I walked to the door, took my jacket from the hook in the entry, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold November air. I could hear Nadia say "Dad" behind me, one word, slightly uncertain. I did not stop. I walked to my car, started it, and drove back to the hotel. I did not feel righteous. I did not feel victorious. I felt the profound, aching grief of a man who loves his child more than anything and has just realized that love alone was never going to be sufficient protection against the person she had chosen. I ordered room service. I ate quietly. I watched the news for an hour without retaining any of it. Then I wrote in my notebook for a very long time. I was not angry on paper. I was clear. That is the difference I want you to understand. Anger is a weather event, clarity is a structure, and I had spent too many years designing structures not to recognize the difference. The next morning I drove home, 4 hours of highway and small towns and the kind of landscape that does not ask anything from you. I arrived at my house, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and called Patricia. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her. She said she would have updated documents ready within the week. The days immediately after the dinner were quiet. No calls from Nadia, no calls from Derek. Calvin called on Friday because word had apparently reached him through some channel, likely Sandra, who seemed to have taken on the role of family communications director, and Calvin asked me carefully what had happened. I told him factually, without drama, what the dinner had been and what had been said. Calvin was quiet for a moment and then said, "That sounded really hard, Louis," and I said it was, and we talked about other things for a while. Calvin did not try to tell me what I should have done differently. I respected him for that. The first contact from Nadia came 8 days after the dinner in the form of a text message. It said, "I hope you got home safe." I replied that I had and that I hoped she was well. That was the end. Tire exchange for 2 more weeks. The second contact came in the form of a phone call 3 weeks after the dinner. Nadia's voice was different, less rehearsed, more searching. She asked if we could talk. I said of course. She said she had been thinking a lot about what happened, and she wanted me to know that she had not meant for the dinner to go the way it did. She said Derek had framed it as a clearing of the air, and she had not fully understood until I was actually walking out the door that she had just handed her father an ultimatum. She said she had felt sick about it ever since. I listened to all of this. I did not rush to reassure her. I let her finish. Then I said, "Nadia, I love you. I have never stopped loving you. But I need you to understand what actually happened at that table." And I told her carefully and clearly what I had observed over the previous 3 years. Not everything all at once, not with emotion designed to wound her, but in plain language with specific examples. I told her about the mug. I told her about the dinner with Paul. I told her about Calvin being contacted. I told her about the phrase "regular support arrangement" and where I believed those words had come from. I told her that I had never once felt like a valued parent in her home with Derek. I told her that I had been waiting, patiently and hopefully, for something to change, and instead things had escalated to the point where I was sitting at a table being given an ultimatum by my own daughter. There was a long silence. Then Nadia said in a very small voice that she did not know Derek had called Calvin, that she had not known the dinner with Paul had been planned that way, that she had thought, she genuinely seemed to have thought, that things between Derek and me were just a normal, manageable friction that would smooth out over time. I believed her. I also knew that not knowing was its own kind of decision, the decision to not look too closely at what was right in front of her. I told her that I was not ending our relationship. I told her I was her father and that would not change. But I told her that things needed to be different, that my financial decisions were mine to make and were not available for outside management, that I expected basic respect when I was present in her home, that if Derek had an issue with me, I expected him to bring it to me directly like an adult, not through my brother or his mother or arranged dinner guests. And I told her that any future conversation about what I owed them, or did not owe them, was a conversation I was no longer willing to have. Nadia cried a little. I held the space for that. I did not apologize for the clarity. I told her I hoped we could rebuild something that was real. She said she wanted that too. I said I hoped she meant it. The weeks that followed were delicate. Derek did not call me. Nadia and I spoke twice more before Christmas, and both calls were careful but warm. She did not mention money. She did not mention Derek's feelings. She asked about my health, my retirement project. I had been restoring an old canoe that winter and my plans for the holidays. She sounded in those calls more like herself than she had in years. Christmas was something I had to navigate. I spent it with Calvin and his family, 4 hours in the other direction. It was a genuinely good Christmas. Calvin's wife made more food than anyone needed, and their 3 kids were loud and happy, and I sat at that table feeling grateful in a way that had nothing to do with money or structures or patterns. Nadia called on Christmas Day. She and Derek had stayed home. She called in the morning and we talked for 20 minutes warmly and lightly. Derek got on the line briefly and said, "Merry Christmas, Louis," and I said the same back to him, and then Nadia came back on and we finished the call. I did not know what that meant about Derek or about anything between us. I took it as a data point and nothing more. In January, Nadia told me something that recontextualized a portion of what had happened. She told me that she and Derek had been in couples counseling since December. She did not offer a lot of detail, which was appropriate. But she said that the counseling had helped her see some things more clearly, and that she was working on being more honest with herself about what she had allowed to happen in some of her relationships. She said it in a careful, general way, but I understood what she meant. I told her that I was glad she was doing that work and that I was proud of her. I meant it. Derek's hours had returned to full capacity by spring, as his company had done well in the first quarter. The financial pressure in their household eased somewhat, and with it, the urgency of their interest in my financial involvement. I noticed this too. I documented it. I am an engineer. I document things. In March, I received an unusual call. It was from Sandra, Derek's mother. She called my personal cell, which I had apparently given to Nadia at some point, and which had made its way to Sandra. She was polite and composed on the phone. She said she had been thinking about the November dinner and felt that she had played a role in an outcome that had not served anyone well. She said she respected that I was a man who had given a great deal to his daughter, and that she had perhaps entered a situation without fully understanding its history. She did not apologize exactly, but it was the closest thing to an apology that her manner allowed for. I thanked her for calling. I told her I appreciated her honesty. The call was brief and sincere, and I thought better of her afterward. By spring, I had settled into something that felt more sustainable. My relationship with Nadia was not what it had been before Derek, but it was more honest than it had been in years. We were speaking plainly. She was asking me actual questions about my life and listening to the answers. She had visited once alone in February. Derek had a work commitment, and we had spent a Saturday together walking a trail near my house and eating at a diner we used to go to when she was young. It was a good day, not a perfect day because there was still distance to close and trust to rebuild, but a real day. Derek and I had a conversation in April. Nadia had asked us both carefully and separately whether we would be willing to speak directly. We agreed. It was a 30-minute phone call. Derek was different on that call than he had ever been in any previous interaction with me. He was quieter. He took more time before answering. He said that he had come from a family where financial support between generations was very openly discussed, and that he had made assumptions about my family that were not his to make. He said he had handled things in ways he regretted. He did not grovel. He did not perform. He spoke carefully, and I believed, to the degree I was able to, that he was being honest. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I told him what I expected going forward, the same things I had told Nadia. He said he understood. We ended the call without warmth exactly, but without hostility. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not walk away from that April phone call feeling that everything was repaired. Repair takes time and it takes consistent behavior over time, not one phone call. But I walked away feeling that I had been heard, which was new, and that the people who had tried to manage me had begun to understand that I was not a manageable man. That mattered. My financial situation remained unchanged. The trust structure remained in place. The rental property income continued quietly. I had not resumed any regular financial involvement in Nadia and Derek's household, and I did not intend to. If Nadia ever came to me with a genuine emergency, the kind that a good father responds to, I would respond. But the infrastructure of managed dependency that Derek had been constructing was dismantled, and I intended to keep it that way. In the summer, 9 months after the November dinner, something unexpected happened. Derek's company offered him a relocation package to a city 12 hours away. It was a significant promotion, a real opportunity, the kind he had been positioning for. He took it. Nadia called to tell me, and I heard, beneath the careful neutrality of her voice, a complicated mix of excitement and grief. She was going to leave the city she had made her life in. She was going to leave her friends, her routines, her favorite restaurant. She was going to follow her husband into a new chapter. I told her I hoped it was a good one. She asked me if I was angry. I said no, honestly. I said I hoped the change gave them both something they needed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know I handled some things wrong, Dad. I know I let things happen that I should have stopped. I said, I know you know that, Nadia, and I love you anyway. She cried a little. I let her. They moved in August. The house they had bought with my down payment was sold. Nadia called me the night they finalized the sale. She said the house had appreciated more than they expected and they had made a comfortable profit. She did not mention the down payment. She did not need to. I did not need her to. I understood by that point that some acknowledgments were not going to come in the form I might have wanted them, and that holding out for them would only extend the distance. What I needed was for the future to look different, not for the past to be forensically catalogued. They moved to the new city. They bought a smaller house. I flew out to visit in October, my first airplane trip in several years. It was a strange trip in some ways, flying into a new city, being driven by Derek to a house I had never seen, sitting in unfamiliar rooms. But Nadia cooked and the food was good, and she had kept a few things from their old house that I recognized, including a photo from her childhood that had sat on a shelf in our old family home. Seeing that photo in this new context made me feel, unexpectedly, that she had carried something forward that mattered. We spent 3 days together. Derek was present but less performative. He asked me once about a bridge project I had mentioned in an earlier call, some engineering history I had been researching in retirement. He listened to the answer. I do not know whether he was interested or whether he was trying. Either way, I appreciated the effort. I flew home at the end of October. My own house was quiet and unchanged. I made coffee in my kitchen and sat at my table and looked at the yard through the window. The canoe was finished by then, sanded and sealed and ready for spring. I had plans to take it out on the lake near my brother's place. I thought about Marlene. I thought about the way she used to sit in this kitchen and drink her coffee in the morning and say almost nothing, just be present, the way people can be present with each other when they have built a real life together. I missed her. I have never stopped missing her. And I thought about the daughter we had raised together, the 41 years of being her father, all the parking lots and dinner tables and transfers and phone calls, and the Tuesday night in November when I pushed back a chair and said 5 words and walked out into the cold. I thought about what those 5 words actually meant. I love you. Goodbye, Nadia. They were not a rejection. They were not a punishment. They were the most honest thing I had said in years. They were the statement of a man who was done pretending, done performing the role of the grateful funding source, done sitting quietly while someone defined his worth for him. They were a refusal to apologize for being a person who deserved basic regard. And they were also, underneath all of it, still love. Just love that had finally learned where its own edges were. If I could say anything to someone sitting where I sat 3 years ago, watching small behaviors pile up and telling yourself it is fine, it is manageable, it will get better, I would say this. A structure that is failing does not announce itself dramatically. It fails through accumulation. Small cracks in the load-bearing walls, stress fractures in the joints, subsidence in the foundation. You can keep adding weight and keep telling yourself it is fine, but the engineering does not lie. At some point, you either make the repairs honestly or you walk away from the building before it comes down on you. I chose to be honest about the cracks. I chose to protect myself without destroying anyone. I chose to remain Nadia's father while refusing to remain Derek's resource. And I chose, on a cold November Tuesday, to say 5 words instead of 100, because 5 honest words are worth more than 100 performances. That is the whole truth, and I am at peace with it. If Lewis's story reached something in you, if you have ever sat at a table where you were expected to apologize for your own dignity, or if you have ever walked away from someone and known, despite the grief of it, that you made the right call, leave a comment below and tell me what you would have said in those 5 words. Tell me the moment you finally stopped carrying what was never yours to carry. This channel exists because these stories need to be told, and because the people living them need to know they are not alone.